I'm standing on stage singing the songs. I know people are getting into what we're doing. So I wasn't worried about Cure fans, but the reach of the album has really been quite disconcerting.
Robert Smith has never spoken about music like a collector. When he names favorites, he is mapping instinct, not prestige. Across years of interviews, 6 rock albums kept resurfacing, records that shaped how he hears space, melancholy, and power. These are not trophies, they are anchors. Number 1, Are You Experienced? By the Jimi Hendrix Experience. This record did not arrive gently. It cracked the frame. For Robert Smith, Are You Experienced? Was the moment rock music stopped obeying its own rules. Hendrix turned distortion into language and instability into emotion. What mattered was not virtuosity, but permission. The idea that sound could feel dangerous, unresolved, and alive, yet still deeply personal. When Are You Experienced? Appeared, the electric guitar was still expected to behave. It was meant to sit neatly inside songs, to decorate structure rather than challenge it. Hendrix ignored that expectation completely. His playing smeared melody into noise until the two became inseparable. Feedback stopped being a technical flaw and became a voice. Distortion was no longer an effect, it was an emotional condition. For Robert Smith, this was not about technique, it was about attitude. The guitar suddenly felt volatile, capable of expressing uncertainty instead of resolving it. There was danger in that sound. Notes bent and slipped. Chords arrived slightly out of focus. Songs felt as if they could collapse at any moment. That instability mattered. Smith was drawn to the sense that the music was alive enough to resist its creator, that it carried risk instead of reassurance. Hendrix once said, "Sometimes you want to give up the guitar. You'll hate the guitar, but if you stick with it, you're gonna be rewarded." That push and pull between frustration and release quietly shaped how Smith understood creative trust. What made the album endure was not chaos alone, but intention beneath it. Hendrix knew exactly how far to push sound before it fractured. Tracks moved between control and collapse with precision, even when they sounded unruly. Smith absorbed that lesson deeply. Emotion did not need to be polished to be meaningful. Its power often came from refusing comfort. Tension was allowed to linger. Resolution was optional. The album also carried a sense of confrontation. Hendrix did not soften his sound to make it accessible. He allowed it to overwhelm, to intrude, to demand attention. That refusal to dilute feeling resonated with Smith, who would later build songs around unease rather than release. Hendrix believed music was something spiritual that could take you somewhere else. For Smith, that idea aligned with his belief that songs were spaces you entered, not objects you consumed. Are You Experienced? Proved that a guitar could communicate without explanation. Hendrix conveyed anxiety, exhilaration, and instability through tone alone. Words were secondary. Smith recognized that power immediately. Music did not need to justify itself intellectually. It only needed to feel honest, even when that honesty was uncomfortable. Over time, Hendrix's influence on Smith became quieter but more permanent. He did not imitate the style or chase psychedelic spectacle. Instead, he carried forward the philosophy beneath it, the idea that imperfection could speak, that noise could linger, that emotion did not need to resolve to be true. In the end, this album offered more than inspiration. It offered permission. Permission to let sound misbehave. Permission to trust instability. Permission to choose feeling over elegance. Hendrix proved that the guitar did not need to behave to be beautiful. It only needed to be honest. Number 2. The Queen is Dead by the Smiths. This album proved that urgency did not require volume. The Queen is Dead moved with nervous intelligence, guitars circling rather than striking, melodies carrying ache without excess. Robert Smith heard how restraint could sharpen emotion, how wit and melancholy could coexist without canceling each other out. It was intensity built sideways, not upward. When The Queen is Dead emerged, much of rock music still equated power with force. Loudness was confidence. Density was seriousness. The Smiths offered a quieter defiance. The guitars did not dominate the songs. They threaded through them. Johnny Marr's playing felt in motion, rarely settling, creating momentum without aggression. For Robert Smith, this approach was revelatory. It suggested that tension could be sustained without release, that emotion could stay unresolved and still feel complete. The album's urgency lived in its restlessness. Guitar lines shimmered, repeated, slipped away, then returned slightly altered. Nothing stood still for long. Smith was drawn to how that movement created anxiety without heaviness. The music felt alert, even brittle, as if it might fracture under its own sensitivity. Marr once explained that he wanted his playing to support the song like architecture, not decoration. That philosophy aligned closely with Smith's own instinct to let atmosphere lead rather than spectacle. What mattered was how the guitar interacted with silence. Marr trusted space. He allowed gaps where other players might fill, letting absence become part of the rhythm. Smith understood the confidence behind that choice. Restraint required belief. It meant trusting that emotion would still land even when it was implied rather than declared. This balance between presence and withdrawal shaped how Smith later thought about arrangement, not as layering, but as conversation. There was also clarity in the album's emotional tone. The songs carried sadness without indulgence, anger without theatrics, which sharpened the melancholy rather than softening it. Smith admired how feeling was communicated indirectly, through suggestion instead of confession. He later reflected that Marr's guitar work felt like a voice that knows when to speak and when to step back. That sensitivity reinforced the idea that power did not need to announce itself to be felt. The Queen is Dead also demonstrated that intimacy could feel urgent. The guitars sounded close, almost conversational, as if responding to the room rather than projecting outward. Smith valued that sense of proximity. It made the music feel human, grounded, and immediate without becoming overwhelming. Emotion arrived quietly, then stayed longer than expected. Over time, the album's influence on Smith became less about sound and more about discipline. He did not imitate Marr's style, but he absorbed the principle behind it. Complexity did not require excess. Intensity did not require force. Subtlety could still feel sharp enough to wound. In the end, The Queen is Dead offered a lasting lesson in control. It showed that urgency could live inside restraint, that emotion could move without shouting. For Robert Smith, it reinforced a belief that music's deepest impact often comes not from what is added, but from what is deliberately held back. Number 3, Kaleidoscope by Susie and the Banshees. Kaleidoscope reframed what a guitar was allowed to be. Instead of leading, it hovered. Instead of resolving, it unsettled. For Robert Smith, this album demonstrated how atmosphere itself could become structure. Repetition became hypnotic. Space became emotional. The music did not explain its darkness. It let you live inside it. When Kaleidoscope appeared, it quietly rejected many of rock's familiar hierarchies. The guitar was no longer the focal point, demanding attention. It became part of the environment, shaping perception rather than directing it. Chords blurred at the edges. Rhythms circled instead of driving forward. For Smith, this was a crucial shift. Music could operate like weather, felt before it was consciously noticed. What distinguished the album was its patience. Songs were willing to linger in uncertainty, allowing patterns to repeat just long enough to become unsettling. The unease did not announce itself. It accumulated. Smith was drawn to how that restraint created psychological tension without spectacle. The album trusted the listener to stay present, to notice subtle changes rather than wait for release. John McGeoch once described his aim as wanting the guitar to create a feeling before you realize where it's coming from. That philosophy aligned closely with Smith's own instinct to let emotion arrive quietly and stay longer than expected. In those performances, the guitar rarely competed with vocals or rhythm. Instead, it hovered just beneath the surface, bending around the song rather than cutting through it. Smith understood the confidence behind that choice. It takes takes restraint to resist filling space. It takes trust to allow tension to exist without resolution. Kaleidoscope never rushed to reassure the listener, and that refusal made its atmosphere feel honest rather than stylized. There was also a textural intelligence running through the album. Effects were not used to impress, but to disorient. Chorus, delay, and modulation became emotional tools, suggesting distance, memory, or unease without spelling anything out. Smith recognized how those sounds could imply feeling without explanation. He later reflected that McGeoch played as if the guitar was painting shadows instead of lines. That image captured exactly why the album lingered. It altered the shape of space rather than filling it. Kaleidoscope also demonstrated that repetition could feel alive rather than mechanical. Slight variations in tone and timing kept patterns shifting just enough to prevent comfort. Smith absorbed that lesson deeply. Mood did not require constant change. It required attentiveness. Darkness could feel immersive rather than aggressive when it was allowed to unfold at its own pace. Over time, the album's influence on Smith became structural rather than obvious. It shaped how songs could be built around absence, how silence could carry weight, how atmosphere could become narrative. Music did not have to dominate to be powerful. It only had to alter the room. In the end, Kaleidoscope offered Smith a lasting permission. Permission to let music hover instead of strike. Permission to trust repetition. Permission to believe that the most enduring sounds are often the ones you feel before you fully hear them. Number 4. Physical Graffiti by Led Zeppelin. This was rock music scaled to myth. Physical Graffiti unfolded like a landscape rather than a collection of songs, and that sense of scope mattered to Robert Smith. He was drawn to its patience, its weight, its belief that drama could accumulate slowly. The album suggested that ambition could feel cinematic without losing intimacy. When Physical Graffiti appeared, it felt less like a statement and more like a world. The songs did not rush to reveal themselves. They stretched outward, layered with space, silence, and anticipation. For Smith, this approach reframed what power in music could mean. Intensity did not need immediacy. It could build gradually, almost ceremonially, allowing mood to do as much work as volume. What stood out was the album's command of pacing. Jimmy Page understood when to hold back and when to let sound expand. Riffs did not simply arrive, they emerged, as if already in motion before the listener noticed them. Smith absorbed that sense of inevitability. Drama felt earned rather than imposed. Page once described his goal as wanting the music to feel bigger than the room it's played in. That ambition, to exceed physical limits without overwhelming the listener, left a lasting impression on Smith's understanding of scale. In performances like that, the guitar does not hurry, it looms. Smith recognized the confidence behind that restraint. Power came not from speed or density, but from patience. Page allowed tension to accumulate slowly, letting repetition and space create gravity. The music trusted the listener to stay with it, to feel anticipation stretch rather than demand immediate release. That trust mattered deeply to Smith, who would later build songs that prioritized atmosphere over momentum. There was also a deliberate mystique woven through Physical Graffiti. Alternate tunings, layered overdubs, and unconventional textures created depth without drawing attention to technique. The guitar often felt less like a lead voice and more like a force shaping the environment. Smith admired how Page treated the studio as a creative instrument rather than a place to document performance. Page once said, "The studio became an instrument in itself." That idea aligned closely with Smith's own belief that sound design could be as expressive as melody. The album also demonstrated that heaviness did not require constant force. Moments of quiet, restraint, and space made the louder sections feel monumental rather than abrupt. Smith absorbed that lesson as one of emotional contrast. Darkness felt heavier when it emerged from stillness. Drama felt larger when it was delayed. Over time, Physical Graffiti influenced Smith less in sound than in mindset. He did not borrow blues phrasing or mythic imagery. Instead, he carried forward the permission to think expansively. Songs could feel like places. Albums could feel like journeys. Ambition did not have to to sacrifice emotional closeness. In the end, physical graffiti offered Smith a vision of scale without excess. It proved that music could be grand without being distant, heavy without being aggressive. It showed that patience itself could be dramatic, and that sometimes the most powerful moments arrive only after you are willing to wait. Number 5. Irish Tour 74 by Rory Gallagher. Nothing about this record felt protected. Irish Tour 74 captured a guitarist exposed, emotion moving straight from instinct to amplifier. Robert Smith heard commitment in its roughness, sincerity in its strain. It reinforced a belief that intensity does not come from spectacle, but from presence, and that honesty often sounds imperfect. When Irish Tour 74 was recorded, it carried no interest in polish or distance. The album placed the listener directly in the room, close enough to hear fingers scrape strings and notes strain under pressure. For Smith, that proximity mattered. It suggested that music could be powerful without insulation, that vulnerability itself could generate force. Gallagher did not perform at the audience. He played with them, reacting to the room rather than controlling it. What defined the record was its refusal to hide. There were no elaborate effects smoothing edges, no production choices designed to elevate performance into myth. The guitar sounded worn, worked, and slightly frayed. Smith recognized something deeply human in that texture. It felt lived in, not curated. Gallagher once said he wanted his playing to sound like it's been lived in, not polished up. That philosophy resonated strongly with Smith's own instinct to value emotional truth over refinement. In those performances, intensity emerged through endurance rather than display. Gallagher stayed with phrases longer than expected, pushing them until something raw surfaced. He did not rush to impress. He allowed moments to stretch, even when they became uncomfortable. Smith admired that patience. It mirrored his own belief that emotion should be allowed to linger, not be resolved quickly for the sake of comfort. The music trusted time to do its work. There was also vulnerability in Gallagher's consistency. Night after night, he played with the same commitment, regardless of venue or scale. That reliability mattered to Smith. Authenticity was not a single moment. It was sustained presence. Gallagher's guitar did not retreat when it cracked. It leaned into strain, turning imperfection into expression. Gallagher once described his relationship with the instrument as a conversation you never finish. That idea of music as dialogue rather than declaration stayed with Smith. Irish Tour 74 also demonstrated that rawness could feel generous rather than aggressive. The guitar invited the listener in. Mistakes were not erased. They became part of the exchange. Smith understood that openness as a form of trust. The music did not ask to be admired. It asked to be shared. Over time, the album's influence on Smith became grounding rather than aspirational. He did not seek to replicate Gallagher's blues language. Instead, he absorbed the reminder beneath it. Commitment matters more than control. Presence matters more than presentation. Intensity does not require protection. In the end, Irish Tour 74 offered a quiet but enduring lesson. It showed that honesty often sounds rough, that sincerity can strain under its own weight, and that music becomes most powerful when nothing stands between feeling and sound. For Robert Smith, that unguarded connection remained essential, a reminder that sometimes the truest performances are the ones that leave themselves exposed. Number 6. Moving Pictures by Rush. This album offered balance. Moving Pictures showed how complexity could remain generous, how discipline could leave room for curiosity. Robert Smith was drawn to its clarity, the way exploration lived inside form without collapsing into chaos. It suggested that evolution did not require abandonment, only flexibility, and that ambition could still feel human. When Moving Pictures appeared, it stood apart from much of progressive rock's reputation for excess. The songs were intricate, but never indulgent. Structure was present, but not rigid. For Smith, this restraint was the key. The album proved that complexity did not need to overwhelm emotion in order to justify itself. Instead, it could quietly expand the listener's listener's sense of possibility. Alex Lifeson's guitar work played a central role in that balance. His parts moved fluidly between clean space and controlled weight, never lingering too long in either. Smith heard curiosity in those transitions, the sense that exploration was happening in real time, but within clear boundaries. Lifeson once explained that he approached the instrument with a sense of curiosity rather than obligation. That mindset resonated with Smith's belief that music should feel exploratory, not dutiful. What impressed Smith most was how emotional warmth survived inside precision. Even the most carefully arranged passages felt alive rather than mechanical. Lifeson allowed moments of playfulness and vulnerability to surface, resisting the urge to turn technique into dominance. The guitar did not assert control, it invited engagement. Smith admired that generosity. It showed that discipline did not have to close doors. It could simply keep them from collapsing. There was also tonal openness throughout the album. Clean passages felt expansive, almost airy, while distorted moments avoided aggression for its own sake. Effects were used to suggest space rather than power. Smith recognized how that restraint shaped mood without crowding it. Complexity existed, but it never pushed the listener away. Instead, it asked them to lean in, to notice how form and feeling coexisted without friction. Lifeson later reflected that he always wanted the guitar to serve the song, not prove a point. That philosophy aligned deeply with Smith's own approach to music. Songs were not demonstrations, they were environments. The purpose of structure was not to display intelligence, but to support atmosphere. Moving pictures also demonstrated that progress did not require rejection of the past. Familiar rock foundations remained intact, but they were gently stretched. Smith valued that continuity. Evolution felt additive rather than destructive. Identity was not erased, it was refined. The album trusted listeners to follow complexity as long as clarity remained. Over time, its influence on Smith became philosophical rather than sonic. He did not replicate Rush's technical language. Instead, he absorbed the permission beneath it. Permission to experiment without chaos. Permission to be ambitious without losing warmth. Permission to grow without severing roots. In the end, Moving Pictures offered a final essential lesson. Music could evolve without becoming cold. Discipline could coexist with curiosity. Complexity could still feel human. For Robert Smith, that balance mattered deeper. A reminder that progress, at its best, does not replace identity. It deepens it. When Robert Smith speaks about favorite albums, he is not building a canon or ranking greatness. He is tracing a quiet philosophy. Each of these 6 records offered a different kind of permission to let sound fracture, to let space breathe, to let patience outweigh force, to let honesty arrive unprotected, to let complexity remain kind. Together, they reveal how Smith learned to trust music as an environment rather than a display. What connects these albums is not genre or era, but intent. They value mood over mastery, feeling over finish, atmosphere over assertion. They remind us that influence is rarely about imitation. It is about what an artist gives you the courage to allow in your own work. Because in the end, legacy is not made by copying sounds. It is made by listening deeply. Which of these albums do you hear most clearly in Robert Smith's music? Share your thoughts. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe for more.